On an ordinary afternoon in South Dallas, the street sounded the same as it had for decades. Children laughed as they cycled between cracked pavements. A man strolled by with his pit bull, nodding a neighborly hello to every passing car. From one open window floated the tender voice of Al Green, reminding everyone of a rhythm older than the bricks that lined the road. Inside a modest white house with squeaky gates and rose bushes climbing high, Aunt Shirley pulled a peach cobbler from the oven. She fussed over her niece the way only an elder can, urging her to stay longer, to eat one more plate, to remember she was still someone's child. The niece in question, dressed plainly in jeans and a blue shirt, teased back with warmth. She carried a tote bag heavy with leftovers and sweet tea, her nails tapping lightly against car keys. For a moment, all was familiar, all was safe. And then, a police cruiser rolled to a halt. 2 officers stepped out, one young, with mirrored sunglasses, the other older, hard eyes fixed upon a woman who belonged to this street more than they ever could. They asked questions she had heard before in another life. Suspicious activity, vague description, demands to search. She replied calmly, firmly, with words heavy with truth. I am Representative Jasmine Crockett. I grew up here. You have no cause. But the badge did not pause. The cuffs did not wait. Cold steel clasped around her wrists on the very driveway where she had once played as a child. The tote bag fell. Cornbread crumbled. A jar of sweet tea shattered into the concrete, seeping into cracks like blood into dry earth. Neighbors watched from porches, voices rising in protest. A teenager named Keon raised his phone, the lens shaking. As he recorded what his heart could hardly accept, it should have ended differently. Yet in that instant, America revealed itself again. A place where even a sitting congresswoman, even one whose name was written into public record, could be dismissed, diminished, shackled for daring to exist, while black, this is where our story begins. Not in the polished halls of Congress, not with the bright lights of television debates, but on a quiet Dallas street where history and injustice collided in front of a house that smelled of cobbler and memory. What followed was not silence. The video spread, first through the fingers of a teenager, then through the veins of a nation. 5,000 views became 50,000. A whisper became a chorus. By morning, the name Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a line on a ballot. It was a rallying cry. And here lies the question, at the heart of this tale. If a congresswoman can be cuffed on her own doorstep, what chance does a young black boy have walking home from school? If truth itself can be ignored when spoken clearly, who will hear us when we call for justice? But know this, Jasmine Crockett was never one to shrink. The steel on her wrists did not silence her. It sharpened her resolve. What they tried to reduce became the very fire that carried her voice further than they could imagine. Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. South Dallas is a place heavy with memory. Its streets carry the imprint of generations who worked, prayed, marched, and endured. For many, this community was both cradle and crucible, a place that nurtured dreams, but also a place where justice often lagged behind the rhythm of daily survival. Jasmine Crockett's childhood was woven into these blocks. She knew the squeak of gates, the smell of fried chicken wafting from kitchens on Sundays, the music of church choirs rising above rooftops. She also knew the harsher sounds, sirens, the heavy knock of police at a neighbor's door, the whispered warnings passed from parent to child about what not to do, what not to say. When the blue lights appeared, it was not unique to South Dallas. Across America, black communities had learned the same lesson: to be careful, to be invisible when authority was near, to survive by instinct. The legacy of mistrust between police and the people was not born yesterday. It was forged through decades of redlining, racial profiling, wrongful stops, and harsher sentences. To understand the moment Jasmine faced those 2 officers, you must understand that history from the Jim Crow South where black men and women were criminalized for the smallest infractions, to the civil rights era, when peaceful marchers were beaten and jailed. America had long equated blackness with suspicion. Even in the 21st century, statistics revealed the same painful truth. Black drivers were far more likely to be stopped without cause. Black youths more likely to be searched. Black women more likely to be dismissed as aggressive or untrustworthy. And yet, within that weight, communities like South Dallas produced resilience. Families like Aunt Shirley's kept traditions alive. The peach cobbler cooling on the counter, the gospel station humming in the background, the open porch where neighbors greeted each other like kin. For Jasmine, those simple rituals were proof of dignity in a world that often denied it. On that afternoon, returning home with groceries and laughter still clinging to her, Jasmine was not just a congresswoman. She was a daughter of South Dallas, a child of that history. When the cruiser slowed to a stop, she recognized the pattern at once. Too many times she had seen that look, suspicion scanning her body like a weapon. The irony was sharp. Jasmine Crockett, a woman sworn to uphold the laws of the United States, was being treated as if she were the enemy of those very laws. In her calm voice, there was both patience and a quiet edge of defiance. "I am Representative Jasmine Crockett. I grew up here." Her words should have been enough, but history had taught her, and every witness on that street, that truth alone rarely shielded black bodies. The officers did what too many had done before them. They chose disbelief over recognition, authority over respect, control over humanity. When the cuffs closed around her wrists, it was not just Jasmine they restrained. It was a community's memory of injustice, repeated. It was a reminder that even in positions of power, a black woman could still be reduced to suspicious. To grasp the full weight of that afternoon, we must step back further. Dallas is no stranger to the struggles of race and power. From the days when black workers built the very roads, yet were denied the houses beside them, to the long summers when police patrolled black blocks with a heavier hand than anywhere else, the city has carried scars. In the 1960s, while Martin Luther King Jr. marched in Selma and Malcolm X thundered from Harlem, Dallas had its own battles: segregated schools, discriminatory housing, police officers who stopped black men for walking too slow or looking suspicious. The faces changed over the years, but the pattern remained. South Dallas became both sanctuary and target, a neighborhood full of culture and pride, but also one too often marked by authority as dangerous. Jasmine grew up in the thick of this. She remembered classmates whose fathers were stopped on the way to work, sometimes for broken taillights that never existed. She remembered mothers whispering warnings to their sons: "Keep your hands visible. Don't argue. Survive the moment." At church, elders prayed not only for salvation but for protection from the very city meant to serve them. And yet, within that struggle, there was beauty. Sunday afternoons filled with barbecue, smoke, and gospel harmonies. Block parties where children raced under streetlights while aunties fanned themselves and traded stories. Men who had little still offering help to neighbors who had less. This duality, joy and injustice, resilience and repression shaped Jasmine long before she ever entered politics. So when those officers approached her outside Aunt Shirley's house, she was not only confronting them in the present, she was confronting centuries that stood behind them. The chain of profiling that stretched from Jim Crow patrols to the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles, from Ferguson, where Michael Brown lay in the street, to Minnesota, where George Floyd's breath was stolen. Each moment echoed in the clink of her handcuffs. But what made this different was the symbolism. This was not a nameless corner. This was her block. Her aunt's window curtain shifted, is a silent witness to history, repeating itself. For Jasmine, the sting was not only the steel around her wrists but the violation of a sacred place, the home where she had once learned to ride a bike, where she had been comforted after schoolyard taunts, where family roots held fast against storms. The neighbors knew it too. When they cried out, "Y'all know who that is. That's Jasmine Crockett." They were not only defending a congresswoman, they were defending their own dignity. Because if even she could be reduced to a suspect here, then no porch, no child, no elder was safe. And then came Keon, the teenager across the street. His phone shook in his hand, but he did not look away. That recording, simple and unpolished, was a torch passed to a new generation. In his silence, in the tremor of his grip, lay a decision to bear witness, to refuse to let this moment vanish as so many had before. By the time the video began its climb across social media, the history of South Dallas was inscribed anew, not just in memory, but in pixels, in voices. Rising beyond the block, beyond the city. This was not only Jasmine's story, it was the story of a people who had waited too long to be seen, too long to be heard. And as Jasmine stood, hands bound, she understood something deeper. The fight was no longer about whether injustice existed. That was plain. The fight was about whether America would continue to look away when the evidence stared it in the face. This was the soil. This was the history pressing down. And from this weight, something was about to grow, a reckoning, a resistance, a voice refusing to be muted. The clip spread like wildfire. What began as a grainy video filmed by a trembling teenager on a bicycle became the spark of a national reckoning. At first, it was just Keon's friends who watched, his classmates sharing the shaky footage with captions filled with shock. Within 1 hour, it crossed 5,000 views. By the next morning, it was everywhere, bouncing from TikTok to Twitter, sliding into Facebook feeds of grandmothers and pastors, picked up by journalists who could not look away. For Jasmine, the weight of it all pressed hardest in the quiet hours of the night. After leaving Aunt Shirley's, she drove until her hands stopped shaking, finally pulling into a lonely car park near Keast Park. The streetlights hummed above her, pale yellow against the dark. While her phone vibrated endlessly beside her, she sat there, wrists still marked from the cuffs, staring into the silence. What she felt was not fear. It was heavier than fear, a bone-deep grief, sharpened by anger, that told her she had stepped once more into the old pattern. Black dignity being dismissed, black voices being doubted, black presence being treated as a threat. At 2:14 in the morning, Jasmine opened her laptop. Words spilled, not carefully arranged, not edited by staffers, but pulled straight from her gut. She wrote of being treated like a stranger in the neighborhood that raised her. She wrote that no badge, no title, no years of service in Congress had shielded her from what so many others had endured. She wrote that this was bigger than her, that it was about the system, and that she would not be silent. She read the statement 3 times, then hit send. The response was immediate. A flood that shook her screen awake. Comments cascaded down her timeline. This is who y'all put in cuffs. South Dallas ain't safe for nobody. We see you. Jasmine. Hashtags. Bloomed. Justice for Jasmine. Truth in the Hill. We hear you. Overnight, she had become more than a woman in handcuffs. She was evidence, a mirror of injustice, and a rallying cry. Yet the moment was not without pain. News anchors referred to her as an unidentified woman detained by police, unidentified. The word cut deeper than the cuffs had to be erased. Even in the face of undeniable truth was an insult, as old as America itself. When she called Aunt Shirley the next morning, her aunt's voice trembled. I never thought I'd see that happen to you. Not you. Jasmine listened quietly, unable to explain that titles and offices meant little when prejudice was at the wheel. She whispered back, I'm okay, but she knew she was not. Through that long morning, requests poured in. MSNBC wanted her live. Roland Martin's show reached out. Local activists texted offers of vigils, marches, petitions. Her aides urged her to cancel the fundraiser scheduled that evening in Highland Park. The whole night has changed. They said, everyone wants to hear from you. Jasmine shook her head. We don't cancel. We reframe. Tell the press, I'll be holding a statement at 2 o'clock outside City Hall. Don't spin it. Don't soften it. They need to hear it. as it happened. Still, doubt gnawed at her. She knew the cycle too well. America had a way of consuming outrage and then discarding it. An incident, an uproar, to a flood of statements. Then silence. Too many names had risen and faded in that rhythm. Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor. Would Jasmine Crockett simply be another in that long list? Her name shouted for a week before the world moved on. Her team gathered in her apartment that night. Papers, laptops, and half-empty takeout boxes cluttered the space. One aide suggested a careful approach, framing the arrest as a misunderstanding. Another worried that too much anger would alienate allies. Jasmine listened, then spoke plainly. If I soften this truth, I betray every neighbor who watched me in cuffs. I won't do that. Silence followed, the kind that comes when conviction is undeniable. Outside her apartment, the storm built. Conservative blogs sharpened their attacks. One headline sneered, "Crockett Crease Wolf." Another questioned whether she had provoked the encounter for political gain. On talk radio, commentators mocked her as playing the race card. Yet even as detractors grew louder, so did her supporters. A grandmother from Shreveport called, just to say, "You stayed calm, and that's what made me cry." A young activist from Oakland posted, "Tell them, Miss Crockett, we got you." Black media embraced her. Roland Martin streamed with righteous fire. This is not just about Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. This is about every black woman whose word has been doubted. In Dallas churches, her name was added to prayer lists. For many, she had become not only a politician, but a daughter, a sister, a symbol of defiance against injustice. But Jasmine knew symbols could be fleeting. If she wanted this moment to matter, she would need to transform it from spectacle into substance. That meant stepping forward, not just as a victim, but as a leader. That meant facing the cameras at City Hall, not with a rehearsed script, but with the raw truth still burning inside her. As she dressed the next morning, she chose the same blue shirt she had been cuffed in. It was not vanity, it was intention. The shirt was a reminder that dignity does not depend on costume. She would stand before the world exactly as she had been when the injustice occurred. A black woman with natural hair, a tote bag, and truth on her lips. When she looked into the mirror, she saw not only herself but generations before her. The marchers in Selma, the mothers in Montgomery, the youths in Ferguson. Their strength was braided into her resolve. The question was no longer whether people had seen the video. They had. The question was whether they would listen to what came next. And Jasmine Crockett, tired but unbroken, was ready to make them listen. By the time Jasmine arrived at Dallas City Hall, the square outside was already alive with movement. Reporters clustered with tripods and cameras, their red lights blinking in the heat of the Texas sun. Neighbors from South Dallas had come too, mothers with folded arms, church deacons in pressed suits, teenagers holding handmade signs that read justice for Jasmine. Some carried nothing but their silence, but even that silence carried weight. Inside the building, aides hurried about, adjusting microphones, whispering. Logistics. Her legal advisor, Ronell Triggs, stood at her side, tall, sharp-eyed, a man known in Dallas for suing the city and winning. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" Jasmine nodded. She had been ready since the cuffs clicked shut. When she stepped out into the open air, the crowd hushed. The cameras tilted up. The murmur softened into anticipation. Jasmine looked out at the faces. Children sitting on parents' shoulders. Neighbors from Bonneview Road. Strangers who had traveled miles because they saw themselves in her story. "For those who don't know me," she began, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "I am Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Yesterday, I was handcuffed outside my aunt's home, on the very street where I learned to ride a bike, where I tracked mud through the kitchen and got my first whooping, where Sundays meant barbecue and music and safety." She paused, letting memories soak into the air. "I told them who I was. They ignored it. They saw a black woman in a blue shirt and decided I didn't belong. A ripple moved through the crowd. Anger, grief, recognition. I wasn't dressed in a blazer. I wasn't holding a microphone. I was just a woman with a bag of leftovers in my hand. And to them, that made me suspicious. The flash of cameras caught the sharpness of her words. Phones lifted higher. A teenager streamed live. The comments flooding in by the hundreds. I am not here for apologies. Jasmine continued, her voice rising. I am here for accountability. We cannot keep patching holes in a sinking ship. We need structural change. Real, enforceable change. Reporters leaned forward, jostling for position. One called out, Congresswoman, do you plan to file a formal complaint? Jasmine met the question head on. Already did. And that is only the beginning. Another asked, what do you say to those who believe the officers were just doing their jobs? Jasmine's gaze fixed on the nearest lens. If doing your job means detaining someone without cause, ignoring their identification, escalating a situation based on nothing but appearance, then the job is broken, and it must be fixed. Applause burst forth, raw and unrestrained. It was not polite agreement, but the kind of applause that rises from the gut, born of lived experience. This is not just about me, she said, steady as stone. This is about every child stopped while walking home. Every parent forced to give their son or daughter the talk on how to survive a police encounter. Every ordinary person who has been treated like a threat before speaking a single word. The crowd grew louder, chants of her name rolling across the plaza. Jasmine raised her voice just enough to ride above the noise. Yesterday, they tried to shrink me, but what they really did was shine a spotlight on a broken system. I will take this fight to Congress. I will introduce legislation that enforces bias training, that demands body camera transparency, that penalizes officers who ignore protocol, not optional PowerPoints, not half measures. Real change. A woman in the crowd cried out, we got your back. Jasmine, she smiled, not in relief, but in resolve. Thank you. But I do not only want your support, I want your attention. I want your pressure. I want your voices, because they will not hear me unless they hear us. The press conference lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact spread far beyond those stone columns. That evening, networks replayed her words on loop. Commentators debated her tone, her strength, her determination. Some praised her clarity. Others accused her of race baiting. But whether loved or loathed, she was impossible to ignore. In the hours that followed, backlash intensified. Conservative outlets labeled her dramatic and self-serving. One headline read, Crockett Kreis Wolf in Dallas stunt. Another suggested she had staged a confrontation for political gain. Ignoring the undeniable evidence filmed from multiple angles, Jasmine refused to answer those charges. She did not waste breath arguing with people who had already chosen disbelief. Instead, she gathered with her team that night, going over messages that poured in threats, cruel words, but also overwhelming support. Former classmates, civil rights attorneys, even a handful of retired police officers sent quiet notes of shame and solidarity. And then came the call from Teresa Gibbons, a retired postal worker from Shreveport. She had no social media account, but her granddaughter had shown her the video. Her voice, shaky but clear, carried across the line. You didn't scream. You didn't panic. You stayed calm. That's what got me. That's what made me cry. Jasmine closed her eyes and whispered, thank you. It was moments like that she realized that made the fight worth every ounce of pain. Because it was not about headlines or hashtags. It was about the quiet hearts who saw themselves reflected in her ordeal and found strength in her resolve. Still, she knew the path ahead was fraught. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated in Washington. Some colleagues warned her to move carefully. Others doubted her ability to transform outrage into legislation. Yet, Jasmine Crockett was not one to bow. She had lived too long in the shadow of doubt, to let it define her now. Her battle had shifted from the driveway of South Dallas to the public square, from bruised wrists to the corridors of power. And she would not retreat. For the first time since the cuffs had closed around her wrists, Jasmine felt clarity. She was no longer simply a congresswoman from Texas. She was the bearer of a truth too sharp to silence, too urgent to delay. And as the sun set on Dallas that night, one truth burned in her chest. The fight had only just begun. The applause at City Hall had not yet faded when the counterattack began. Within hours, conservative blogs splashed mocking headlines across their pages. Crockett cries wolf in Dallas stunt, screamed one. Another suggested she had staged the incident as a political ploy. Talk radio voices thundered accusations of race baiting, as if her humiliation on her own driveway had been little more than theater. Television pundits chuckled on late-night panels, raising eyebrows at her story, ignoring the multiple camera angles circulating online. A commentator on a national network sneered. She claims to be a victim, but looks more like an opportunist. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how deeply prejudice could twist reality. Jasmine had expected resistance. She had not expected the venom. Death threats landed in her office voicemail. Anonymous callers breathed heavy silence down the line, then hung up. Emails arrived, filled with slurs, some wishing her harm, others urging her to go back to D.C. and stay out of Texas. Each one was a reminder that she had rattled cages not meant to be touched. Her staff, exhausted and weary, urged caution. They're coming for you harder now. Ronell Triggs warned, scrolling through screenshots of hateful messages. Jasmine looked up, her jaw set. I've been ready. Yet amidst the storm of hatred, another current surged, one of solidarity. Civil rights lawyers reached out with offers of support. Community leaders from Phoenix to Baton Rouge called, promising to march if she needed them. Old classmates wrote, "We always knew you were a fighter." Some support came from unexpected places. A handful of retired police officers sent private notes of shame. One wrote simply, "We failed you. I am sorry." The words, brief as they were, reminded Jasmine that the fight was not against individuals, but against a system that trained suspicion deeper than justice. And then came a call that silenced even her strongest resolve. It was from Teresa Gibbons, a retired postal worker in Shreveport. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I saw what they did. You didn't scream. You didn't panic. You stayed calm. That's what broke me. That's what made me cry." Jasmine pressed her forehead against her hand, whispering, "Thank you." Teresa asked for nothing, only to tell her that dignity, even in chains, could be a weapon. Meanwhile, social media continued to burn with her name. Hashtags surged. "Justice for Jasmine. We see you. South Dallas speaks." Some turned her calm defiance into memes, her words captioned in bold letters. "If the job is broken, it must be fixed." The image of her with cuffs on her wrists spread across platforms, half symbol, half rallying cry. But for every message of love, there was another of cruelty. Anonymous accounts flooded her mentions with hatred, calling her dramatic, dishonest, aliar. Her aides begged her to stop scrolling. Yet Jasmine read them all, not out of masochism, but out of recognition. "If I don't see what they say," she told Triggs, "I forget what I'm fighting against." Even as detractors screamed, the tide of allies grew louder. Black journalists gave her story weight without sensationalizing her pain. Darnell Beck, a seasoned reporter in Dallas, published an editorial titled, "Not a Stunt, a Pattern." He wrote, "Jasmine Crockett's humiliation is not an isolated incident. It is a mirror reflecting what countless black citizens endure quietly each day." National leaders began to take notice. A congressman from Pennsylvania called to offer co-sponsorship for any bill she drafted. Senator Leanna Fields of California sent a message of support, and, in a quiet but telling move, even an independent representative from Iowa, rarely one to speak on issues of race, phoned her office and said, What happened to you should never happen to anyone. If you move forward, I will stand with you. Still, not all were convinced. In the corridors of power, whispers rose that she was too fiery, too unyielding, too willing to make enemies. Washington, ever cautious, frowned at voices that refused to be tamed. Jasmine felt the tension coil around her shoulders. At night, she sat at her dining table with papers scattered, drafting and redrafting outlines for legislation. Her eyes burned, her body begged for rest, but she pressed on. Each hateful headline became fuel. Each supportive message became a shield. She knew she was walking a thin line. To some, she was a symbol of courage. To others, a target. And yet, she would not choose silence. Silence, she reminded herself, had never protected anyone. Her story had already moved beyond South Dallas. It had become part of the national conversation, a thread in the tapestry of America's reckoning with justice. The question was no longer whether she had been wronged. The question was whether she would let that wronging be swallowed by the cycle of outrage and amnesia. The answer, in her heart, was clear. This was not a moment. It was a movement. And Jasmine Crockett would carry it, no matter the cost. The dining table in Jasmine Crockett's apartment no longer looked like a place for meals. It was buried under stacks of papers, open laptops, highlighters that had long lost their caps, and coffee mugs stained with sleepless nights. To an outsider, it might have looked like chaos. To Jasmine, it was order being born from chaos. Every page scattered across that table carried the possibility of transformation, the promise of a future where what happened to her in South Dallas would not happen again. Her team gathered almost every night. Some were seasoned political aides, hardened by years in Washington. Others were younger activists, brimming with urgency, impatient with slow change. At times they clashed, at times their voices grew sharp. But Jasmine welcomed the tension. Pressure makes diamonds, she reminded them. And right now, we need the hardest diamond this country has ever seen. Ronald Triggs, her sharp legal advisor, often played the role of anchor. He would sit quietly as voices rose, then cut through with clarity. We need structure, he said one evening, tapping his pen on the table. We can draft all the passion in the world, but if this does not withstand the scrutiny of hostile committees, it will die before it reaches a vote. Jasmine nodded. He was right. Passion lit the flame, but law gave it permanence. The bill began to take shape. At first, it was a sketch. Just bullet points and broad strokes. Accountability, transparency, prevention. But Jasmine refused to let it remain abstract. She demanded detail. How would funding be tied to compliance? What exact powers would civilian boards hold? How quickly should body camera footage be released? Her staff researched precedents, combing through civil rights law, state-level reforms, even obscure county ordinances that had shown glimmers of success. Slowly, the draft thickened into a living document, yet each clause carried risk. The National Registry of Police Misconduct sparked fierce debate even within her own circle. A young strategist argued it would be branded a blacklist and dismissed as unconstitutional. Jasmine pushed back. "Do you know what is unconstitutional?" she asked, a voice sharp. "Being handcuffed on your own driveway with no cause. Being erased in your own neighborhood. If a registry makes them uncomfortable, then we are finally asking the right questions." Her conviction ended the debate. The registry would stay. The nights bled into mornings. Jasmine's apartment smelled of reheated noodles and strong coffee. The hum of laptops became the soundtrack of their labor. Sometimes she would rise, walk to the window, and stare out at the Dallas skyline. Her thoughts always drifted back to Aunt Shirley's house, to Keon's shaky video, to the sting of metal on her wrists. That memory was not a wound anymore. It was fuel. Outside her circle, whispers spread quickly. Washington heard rumors of the bill before Jasmine officially mentioned it. Some colleagues called her privately, advising caution. Ambition kills careers. One told her, Another suggested she wait for a safer moment. When the political climate might be more favorable, Jasmine thanked them politely, then closed her phone with a sigh. She had not entered politics to play safe. Of course, opposition did not stay silent. Conservative blogs painted her as a radical out to dismantle policing. Police union representatives warned on television that her reforms would tie the hands of officers and endanger communities. One cable host sneered, "The Congresswoman wants criminals coddled and cops shackled." Jasmine listened, but did not flinch. "If they are afraid," she told Triggs, "then it means we are cutting close to the bone." Meanwhile, support grew stronger than even she had expected. Pastors in Dallas spoke of her courage during Sunday sermons. Civil rights veterans phoned her office, some in tears, saying they had prayed for decades to see legislation like this take shape. Students sent handwritten letters declaring that her fight gave them hope. Even a handful of retired police officers wrote anonymously, ashamed of their profession's silence, urging her not to back down. The Community Integrity Act, as it was now formally named, contained pillars, clear and uncompromising. Federal funding would be tied to compliance with bias training and accountability standards. Civilian review boards would hold subpoena power, not just advisory roles. Body camera footage would be released within days, preventing departments from burying truth under bureaucracy. And above all, the National Misconduct Registry would ensure that no officer who abused power in one city could quietly be rehired in another. As the draft neared completion, the pressure intensified. Death threats multiplied. Anonymous calls filled her voicemail. One note slipped under her office door read simply, "Stop now. On regrette it." Her staff grew restless. Some suggested hiring private security. Jasmine refused at first, but later agreed when she saw the worry etched in Aunt Shirley's eyes. Even so, she would not be silenced. "If they try to scare me," she said, "it is only because they fear the light we are shining." One evening, Congressman Theo Branch called with booming enthusiasm. "You write it, Jasmine, and I will stand beside you." Loud and clear. Senator Leanna Fields added her name to the cause, declaring, "This is not just legislation, it is survival." And, in an unexpected twist, a quiet, independent representative from Iowa, a man who rarely touched issues of race, phoned her office. His words were brief but steady. "What happened to you should never happen to anyone. I will stand with you." By now, Jasmine's apartment no longer felt like home. It was a war room. Its walls, echoing with late-night debates and tired laughter, but the sense of purpose outweighed the fatigue. They were not merely drafting a bill, they were drafting a new standard for justice. On the final night before announcement, Jasmine stayed awake long after her staff had left. She spread the draft pages across her table, reading each line aloud. The lamplight caught the ink, making it shimmer. At 3 a.m, she placed her pen down, whispered a prayer, and pressed her palm against the title page. Community Integrity Act. She walked to the window and watched the city breathe beneath her. "This is for Aunt Shirley," she whispered, "for Keon, for every child told they don't belong." As dawn broke, Jasmine brewed coffee, tied her hair back, and dressed in the same calm blue that had once been labeled suspicious. She looked in the mirror, not at a victim, but at a lawmaker ready for war. "They may call me too bold," she told her reflection, "but tomorrow, when I step onto that floor, they will call me heard." She slipped the draft into a leather folder, tucked it beneath her arm, and walked out the door. Behind her, the apartment still carried the scent of long nights and hard work. Ahead of her, Congress awaited a battlefield where her bill would face fire. And Jasmine Crockett, daughter of South Dallas, was ready. The halls of Congress had always carried a kind of theater, marble columns, polished floors, the echoes of hurried footsteps. It was a stage where power played out in endless acts. But for Jasmine Crockett, walking into the chamber with the Community Integrity Act tucked under her arm felt like stepping into the most dangerous performance of her career. Her staff trailed behind, carrying binders heavy with research. Triggs whispered reminders about procedure, amendments, likely objections. But Jasmine hardly heard him. Her mind was steady, fixed on a single truth. This bill was more than politics. It was her life written into law. The first challenge came not from the opposition, but from her own party. In a closed-door caucus meeting, senior colleagues circled her like hawks. A congressman from the Midwest cleared his throat, speaking with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Representative Crockett, your intentions are noble, but this registry clause will never pass committee. Too radical, too heavy-handed." Others murmured agreement. Jasmine let the silence stretch before replying. "Radical," she said slowly, "is what they call the Civil Rights Act. Heavy-handed is what they called women demanding the vote. If those before us had listened to words like yours, none of us would be sitting here now." The room fell quiet. She knew she had made enemies, but she had also made her stance clear. When the bill was formally introduced, the backlash erupted like thunder. Conservative members lined up at microphones to condemn it. "This is an attack on law enforcement," one declared. Another sneered. "The Congresswoman is legislating from personal grievance." Their words were sharp. But Jasmine had anticipated every strike. She stood, waiting, letting them expend their fury before she rose. Her speech was not long, but it carried weight. She spoke of being handcuffed in front of her family home, of the neighbors who watched in horror, of the boy named Keon, whose camera turned humiliation into proof. She did not plead for sympathy. She demanded recognition. "This bill is not about me," she told them. "It is about the thousands who cannot stand here and speak for themselves. It is about ensuring that no one else is treated as invisible in their own community." The chamber stirred. Cameras flashed. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few, unexpectedly, leaned forward, listening. Outside the chamber, the fight grew louder. Lobbyists swarmed. Police unions launched campaigns. Editorials filled newspapers. One headline read, "Crockett's Bill, Reform or Ruin." On talk radio, callers raged that she was anti-police, unpatriotic, yet in community centers, churches, and living rooms, her name was spoken with pride. One night, after a particularly grueling debate, Jasmine sat alone in her office. The Capitol dome glowed through the window, a reminder of both power and fragility. She replayed the arguments in her head, the jeers, the dismissals. For a moment, doubt whispered, what if they bury this? What if it never reaches the floor? But then she thought of Aunt Shirley's trembling voice, of Teresa Gibbons, the retired postal worker who had called just to say she was proud. She thought of the little girl in the school gym who asked if she was scared. And suddenly, the doubt dissolved. "I cannot stop," she told herself. "Even if they bury the bill, they will not bury the truth it carries." The next committee hearing stretched for hours. Opponents dissected every clause, trying to strip the bill of its teeth, strike the registry, remove civilian oversight, delay body camera release. Each amendment was a blade, meant to dull its edge. Jasmine fought. Each one, sometimes losing ground, sometimes holding firm. Her voice grew hoarse, but she refused to falter. At one point, Representative Holloway from Georgia leaned across the table, smirking. "Congresswoman, you can shout as loud as you want, but this bill is dead on arrival." Jasmine met his gaze, steady as stone. "If you think I will stop speaking because you dismiss me, you do not know me, and you do not know the people who sent me here." The tension spread beyond Washington. Back in Dallas, vigils were held. Supporters gathered with candles, chanting her name. Hashtags trended again. Keon, the teenager who filmed her, became an unexpected activist, speaking at rallies, his young voice trembling, but powerful. Jasmine watched clips on her phone between sessions, each one renewing her strength. In late-night strategy meetings, her allies began to believe. Congressman Branch slapped the table after one breakthrough. They thought they could scare you off. Instead, you've turned this chamber upside down. Ava moderates, once wary, started to drift toward her side, calculating that opposing her too loudly might cost them with a public hungry for change. But victory was far from certain. Powerful committees still held the bill hostage, delaying votes, bearing it under procedural hurdles. Jasmine learned patience, but she also learned persistence. Every delay became an opportunity to rally more voices, to push harder, to make the silence costlier for those who resisted. On the day the bill finally reached the floor for debate, the gallery was packed. Civil rights leaders, students, clergy, even Aunt Shirley sat watching. Jasmine could feel their presence like armor around her. As she rose to speak, she caught Keon's eye in the gallery. He held up his phone, recording again. She smiled faintly. This bill will not erase every injustice, she began, but it will plant a marker in the soil of this nation. A marker that says, we saw, we remembered, and we acted. If you vote against it, you will be telling every citizen who has been humiliated, every family who has grieved, every child who has asked why they were treated as less, that their pain does not matter. And I will not let you say that without resistance. The chamber erupted once more. Applause from some, jeers from others. But Jasmine stood her ground. For the first time since that night in South Dallas, the weight in her chest lifted. She was no longer only the woman in cuffs. She was the Congresswoman who turned injustice into law. The vote had not yet come. The outcome was uncertain. But Jasmine Crockett knew one thing with clarity. The fight had already changed the nation. And whether they passed her bill or not, she had carved truth into the record. It could not be erased. The weight of history does not always fall in grand speeches or sweeping laws. Sometimes it pressed down and keyed her moments. A woman walking back to her car with groceries. A boy holding up his phone. A community whispering. We saw it too. For Jasmine Crockett, what began as humiliation on her family's driveway had become something far larger. By the time the Community Integrity Act reached Congress, the story had traveled across neighborhoods, across states, across generations. Elderly women who had marched in Selma called her office to say they recognized the fire. Young students wrote essays about courage, citing her name alongside Rosa Parks and John Lewis. In church basements and school gyms, her story became a parable, not of victimhood, but of resistance turned into action. Yet Jasmine never allowed herself to be consumed by the image of a lone hero. She reminded everyone that this was never just about one woman in handcuffs. It was about every voice that had been silenced. Every person treated as less because of skin, gender, or poverty. She carried their stories with her, weaving them into each speech, each clause, each demand for accountability. In the months that followed, the debates grew fierce. There were compromises, setbacks, and new attacks. Some colleagues dismissed her as too loud, too insistent. But even in the face of ridicule, Jasmine held steady. She remembered the eyes of the children at that elementary school, the trembling voice of Teresa Gibbons on the phone, the faith in Keon's recording. These were the reasons she could not bend. When the day of the vote finally arrived, the outcome was still uncertain. Members shuffled in, some already hardened in their choices. Others, swayed by the tide of public pressure. Jasmine sat quietly, hands folded on the desk. A photograph of her neighborhood tucked inside her folder. She knew whatever the result, the record of this moment could not be erased. The tally came in slowly. Each aye and nay echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat. She counted them without moving her lips, and when the final numbers appeared, she closed her eyes. The bill had passed the House by a narrow margin. The fight in the Senate still awaited, but the first wall had been broken. Outside, supporters erupted into cheers. Reporters rushed forward. Jasmine stepped to the microphone, but her words were not triumphant. They were steady, rooted. "This is not my victory," she said. "This belongs to every person who ever wondered if their pain mattered. Today, we told them it does." In Dallas, Anne Shirley watched the news with tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Keon, phone in hand, posted 3 simple words. "We did it." But Jasmine knew the journey was only beginning. One bill would not dismantle centuries of bias, One vote would not heal every wound, yet it had shifted the ground beneath their feet. It had forced the nation to look, to argue, to reckon, and in that reckoning, there was hope. That evening, Jasmine returned to her apartment, now quiet. After months of sleepless work, she placed the signed draft of the bill on her table and sat in silence. The city hummed outside, alive, unknowing of tomorrow's battles. She thought of her younger self, the girl who once rode her bike down Bonneview Road, who once cried in Aunt Shirley's arms. After cruel words at school, what would she say if she saw the woman sitting here now? Jasmine smiled softly. She would tell her, "You were never too loud. You were never too much. You were exactly what the world needed you to be." The fight was far from over, but something inside her had settled. She no longer carried only the memory of cuffs biting into her wrists. She carried the memory of rising after them, taller, sharper, unyielding. For the people who watched her that day on Bonneview Road, the message was clear. Injustice can try to humiliate, but it cannot erase dignity. It can wound, but it cannot silence. And when truth is spoken with courage, it travels farther than fear ever could. So the story did not end with one Congresswoman walking out of the Capitol. It continued in classrooms where children drew pictures of heroes who looked like them. It continued in communities drafting their own reforms, inspired by her stand. It continued in the echo of her words. If doing your job means detaining someone without cause, then the job is broken and we will fix it. And in the quiet streets of South Dallas, where roses still curled under Aunt Shirley's window, the neighborhood carried a new rhythm. The rhythm of resilience, the rhythm of a people who refused to be invisible, the rhythm of a congresswoman who turned one moment of injustice into a movement for justice. Because in the end, Jasmine Crockett was not just a woman handcuffed on her own driveway. She was the proof that even in the face of silence, one voice can rise. And when that voice refuses to be alone, when it becomes the chorus of a people long denied, it can change not just a neighborhood, not just a city, but a nation.